Hello, hello! Welcome back to Brenda's Books. Thank you so much for joining me to listen to more of Queen Andrea. Today we are on Chapter 11. Here we go. Chapter 11. The Real Nightmare. Queen Andrea watched the lazy stream flow past her while sitting on a stone bench in the palace courtyard. She dug her bare feet into the earth to feel the cool, soft dirt in between her toes. "What are you doing here?" said a gruff voice. Andrea glanced up to see her husband, King Gordon, towering over her. How could this be? "Oh no!" Andrea cried within herself. She must have fallen off her horse, and now she was dead, and stuck with this horrible man again. But Providence surely would not send her to the same place as this monster, right? Gordon's round face and bloodshot eyes glared at her with open disdain. "This is my spot. Get off." He shuffled his feet and plopped himself down on the bench, his large potbelly protruding over the edge of it. Andrea stood before he could shove her to the ground. "I do not see your name written on this bench, Gordon. You cannot claim it as your own." "Everything here is my possession," he growled. "I own it all." The queen wanted to point out that all of his wealth came from his family line and had little to do with him. But the last time she had mentioned this, Gordon had... She shuddered away the thought. Andrea snatched her high heels off the dirt floor and proceeded to put them on. "You are not wearing shoes?" Gordon asked, flabbergasted. Then he barked out a laugh. "Jace!" Gordon called to the stable master, who happened to be leading his horse through the flower gardens behind them. "The queen is barefoot. Have you heard of anything so ridiculous?" Gordon's laughter lowered to mocking gutturals. As he continued to rumble, Gordon's hands rapidly distorted into long, sharp claws, and his large head sprouted solid red horns. Andrea watched in repugnance as his horns grew at an alarming rate until they reached the size of a ram's. Jace forced out a high-pitched laugh. "No, your majesty, that is ridiculous." Even as he said this, Jace looked as though he felt sorry for the queen. Andrea's cheeks burned. Now that her high heels were secure on her feet, she clicked her way over the cobblestoned paths where Caleen suddenly appeared by her side. "Are you all right, Andrea?" Gordon snorted. "She shows concern for the poor little queen, eh? What, is she your friend?" He sneered. His red eyes now dripped with crimson blood. He hooted some more, then shouted in a boisterous voice, "Just think of the absurdity! A servant! As a friend!" The queen heard laughter in the distance, but she could not see who it was. The shrill sound echoed and rang in her ears. Now Caleen's cheeks burned. Andrea hooked their elbows together, and the two of them made their way to the many ascending steps of the palace entrance. Suddenly, the entire Chaldean council appeared in straight lines on either side of the two ladies, laughing and taunting them as they paraded by. Dolian was first in line. He gave Andrea a nasty smirk. "And you call yourself a queen? How disgraceful!" His mouth curved up until his lips split into his trademark wicked grin. Andrea lifted her chin as she passed, but Marquis Draven's face revealed nothing less than disgust. "You are preposterous, childish. You will never be worthy of the head crown." Andrea clenched and unclenched an angry fist. The entire core of her body shook with the urge to punch him, but somehow her arm lacked the strength to even move. The Marquis thundered a booming laugh, which somehow split the sky with lightning, and a sudden rain began to pour. The queen tightened her hold on Caleen, who now quivered with noisy sobs. The lines of noblemen pointed at her and laughed. This enraged the queen. "That is quite enough!" she yelled. But her protest only made the men's laughter all the more hysterical. Their fine suits were now soaked, and their hair dripped water down their faces and over their mocking smiles. Andrea lifted her skirts as she and Caleen ascended the stairs. But the more they pressed forward, the longer and steeper the steps became. Just when she thought she had reached the top, more stairs would appear. Her head whirled with dizziness, and her wet feet ached. She reached down to remove her high heels, only to discover that her feet were liquefying into mud, and she collapsed on the hard stone steps, taking Caleen down with her. Caleen shifted to face the queen. "Andraya, what is wrong?" "She has forgotten to eat," said a new voice. As Andraya glanced toward the sky and blinked the rain out of her eyes, she found Prince Steffan standing over her. "Can you believe that, gentlemen?" he called over his shoulder. "The queen actually forgot to eat." The men burst with laughter again, and Steffan joined them. Then he crouched next to her, his face dripping water onto hers. "How foolish can you be? It is beyond ridiculous." He turned his head to the side. "Is it not, Dolian?" Dolian's face suddenly appeared, and he crouched in front of her as well. "I have never seen anyone so foolish." Andraya tried to squirm away from the men, but the muddy hem of her dress was now dripping upward and slowly transforming her entire body into muddy liquid. Steffan and Dolian looked at each other and roared with laughter. "Bartholomew, come look at this," Steffan called. Then Bartholomew's head appeared in the circle above hers. Although his head looked very much like a ripe cherry, and when his mouth opened to speak, he spewed red cherry juice all over the queen's face. He exchanged glances with Steffan and Dolian, and the three of them snickered and scoffed. The more they laughed, the more cherry juice splattered her cheeks. She licked her lips and tasted cherries mixed with mud. "Wake up, Andraya. You need to eat," Bartholomew said, as he sprayed more juice in her eyes. "Wake up, please." Then Bartholomew's cherry head opened like a snake's unhinged jaw, ready to swallow her whole. The queen's body jolted upright, and she gasped for air. "Andraya? Andraya!" Caleen's face appeared in front of her again. She grasped the queen's shoulders, and Andraya coughed and wheezed. The queen managed to identify her surroundings and found she had not been consumed by Bartholomew's cherried jaw, nor was she outside in the pouring rain. Rather, she was sitting up in a bed in the palace infirmary. She blew out a heavy sigh of relief and slumped back on her pillow. "I am so glad that was a dream," the queen mumbled. Caleen patted Andraya's cheeks as she stared at her with wide eyes. "Nurse Rose, the queen is awake," she called. Andraya was tucked away in a private corner. She would have been closed off completely from the rest of the large hospice, but one wall was not yet constructed. King Gordon had ordered a private sick room to be built for him in the last days of his life, but it was not completed before he died. Perhaps the nurses thought the three-walled room was what Andraya desired as well, but she would much rather have been in one of the beds near the glass walls that looked out at the gurgling stream that flowed through the orchards. Along one of her three walls sat two gold-colored cushioned chairs, on top of a circular quilted rug of the Chaldrayan flag. Adjacent to her bed stood a gold nightstand with a vase full of fresh lilacs. Moments later, a jolly plump woman appeared at her side. She wore a faded white gown, along with a white cap. She spoke in a sweet, motherly tone. "Oh, my dear queen, you have certainly broken a sweat. Lie down, honey, lie down." Andraya obeyed, still not certain what she was doing here. "Just catch your breath now," the nurse continued. Her rosy, chubby cheeks bobbed up and down with her chin as she spoke. "My, that must have been some nightmare you had." Andraya put her wrist up to her forehead and closed her eyes. "You have no idea." The nurse took the same wrist in her hand and checked the queen's pulse. "Miss Caleen, you best go tell cook that Her Majesty is ready for that food." "Yes, ma'am," Caleen said, as she scurried away. "Here, Your Majesty. I'll just put these two pillows on the wall behind you," the nurse said, in her sweet, lilting voice. "This way you can sit up and be comfortable. I know your own bed is better, but His Highness insisted we put you where he could stay. He's been very worried over you." Then Andraya spotted Prince Steffan, leaning against the wall some distance away from her bed. She clapped a hand over her mouth before an inadvertent yelp could escape. He looked so statuesque he could have been part of the mural. Even still, How had she not noticed him? The prince wore an unfathomable expression. "Is she all right?" he asked the nurse. "Oh, I believe so, your highness. Probably a bit disoriented. But I bet she'll be right as rain before we know it." Andraya coughed in response. She covered her mouth with her elbow while the nurse patted her on the back. "Did she catch a cold?" Steffan asked, taking an anxious step forward. He spoke Chaldean, and Andraya had to laugh at herself, now that she realized how obviously different it was than his fluent Medianese. "It is too early to tell, your highness. But if she hadn't been wearing that fine jacket of yours, she most certainly would have." Oddly, this didn't seem to ease the worry creasing Steffan's forehead. "What happened?" Andraya asked Steffan. Steffan rubbed his brow and closed his eyes. "You fainted again, riding home." His Chaldean seemed a little more broken, now that he was a bit stressed. "I did?" The nurse leaned over with a jolly expression and spoke in a low voice. Andraya was not quite certain if Steffan could hear her or not. "And he caught you, your majesty. And he took the reins for the rest of the way home with you in one arm. Is that not romantic?" she said with a giggle. "Is he your new beau?" Then her voice lowered its teasing cadence. "I dare say. He is almost as handsome as that Chancellor Dolian." She giggled some more. Andraya saw Steffan roll his eyes, and she knew he had heard everything. Nurse Rose was the only servant in the palace who consistently got away with acting improper. Andraya wondered why she had allowed it for so long. Perhaps it was because the queen enjoyed the unguarded openness of Rose. After all, it was the nurse's cheerfulness that made all of the queen's prior trips to the infirmary somewhat bearable. "Here is your breakfast, your majesty," Caleen said, as she bustled in the room with a tray full of steaming hot bacon and eggs and biscuits, along with a plethora of fruit. "Breakfast? Have I been here all night?" Andraya cried in dismay, despite the fact that she should have guessed this, since the entire infirmary shone bright with sunlight. "We have all been here all night," Nurse Rose said. "What?" Andraya bounced her eyes back and forth between them. "What on earth for?" "We have all been worried about you," she answered. "And these two insisted on staying until you woke up." Andraya looked at Steffan and Caleen with exasperation. "For what purpose? To watch me sleep? Could you not think of a less boring form of entertainment?" Caleen slid the tray of food onto the queen's lap. "Well, you did not sleep soundly. Nurse Rose said your heart rate kept spiking." She placed a small hand on the queen's forehead. "What were you dreaming about just now?" Andraya rolled her head. "Oh, it was awful." The three of them waited for her to proceed. "Well, she stammered. "Lord Bartholomew turned into a cherry. Then he tried to eat me." Nurse Rose let out a hoot, and Caleen giggled. Steffan cracked a smile, and finally the worry lines creasing his forehead relaxed. "Oh, I feel so much better now that you are awake," said Caleen. "I would feel better still if you were to eat, your majesty," said the prince. "Oh, well, do not mind if I do. These biscuits are my favorite." Andraya picked one up and took a bite. "That is why I requested them," said Caleen with a grin. Andraya patted Caleen's hand. "You are a gem. And is this strawberry water?" Caleen nodded and Andraya took a sip. I love it." 3 sets of eyes stared at the queen as she took a fork to her eggs. Mid-air, she set the fork down again. "Now that I am awake, none of you need to stay. I am capable of eating entirely on my own." No one budged. "Do not tell me you all intend to watch me devour my breakfast." No one spoke, and no one moved. Andraya rolled her eyes. She wanted to order them out, but that would have taken more energy than she wanted to exert. Besides, she was famished, and certainly did not want her eggs to get cold. Cold eggs were only good for dogs. Nurse Rose busied herself with washing the walls of the infirmary, while Andraya ate her meal. She had no idea why Rose felt this was important at the moment, but Andraya loved her food too much to ask. Steffan settled himself in one of the cushioned chairs and began flipping through the pages of an odd-shaped book Andraya had never seen. Caleen sat on the side of the queen's bed, facing Andraya, and prattled in their native tongue of Medianese. Caleen only did this when she had a lot to say and did not want others to hear. "The prince told me how you raced into the night to send off your letter from my mother. I cannot tell you how much I love you for it. I would give you a big hug right now, but Nurse Rose would see. And I know her heart is big on caring for others, but you and I both know she is still a bit of a gabbling goose, and would tell everyone of our friendship." Caleen whispered this, despite her speaking Medianese. "But the prince told me you mentioned to him we were friends." "Oh, I am so sorry, Caleen," Andraya said, squeezing Caleen's hand briefly. "I do not know why I did that. He sways me to open up." Caleen grinned. "I am not upset. I think we can trust him." "You do?" Andraya asked, with one raised eyebrow. Of course she does, the queen thought. Caleen is too trusting of people. Caleen nodded energetically. "Did you know he speaks Medianese?" "Yes, I did." Andraya expected the prince to cut in and tease her about this, but he appeared engrossed in his book, and not at all aware he was the subject of their conversation. Caleen continued prattling at top speed. "And I am so sorry I yelled at you. I feel so awful. I should have known you would find a way to send the letter. And the prince told me how you had fainted because you were too stressed to eat. I had no idea you were that stressed. I should have done more for you. At the very least, I should have brought food to you during your hours and hours of study. I do not know why I did not think of it. I have been a horrible friend. Caleen, please," Andraya interjected. Caleen paused. Andraya swallowed a juicy orange before she spoke. "You have nothing to apologize for. If anything, it should be me apologizing." Caleen shook her head with vigor. "Yes," Andraya insisted. "You have always been a phenomenal friend to me. From the very beginning you have been nothing but good and loyal and sweet and giving. And She paused to take a breath. "I should think of you more often than I do." Caleen clasped a hand with hers as tears streamed down her face. "You are the nicest queen ever." Andraya smirked. Not so. She lifted her cup to take another sip, but set it back down before she could. "Ugh, I cannot finish. I feel sick." She slid further in her sheets to lie down. "What is this on your cheek?" Caleen brushed her fingers lightly over the queen's jawline. "Nurse Rose, come look at this," she called. By the time Rose reached her bedside, Andraya hardly noticed the nurse's shaken expression, since the cramps in her stomach were suddenly accelerating. Then Steffan approached her as well. "Are you all right, my queen?" Andraya shook her head as she felt a hammering headache emerge behind her eyes. "This is all very sudden, is it not?" Caleen asked the nurse. Rose nodded. "And the rash is spreading to her lips." Steffan stared at her as if he were thinking very hard. "I've seen this before," he said. "When I was in the kingdom of Sandrian, He stopped short. His face revealed nothing but shock. "Nurse Rose, Dr. Mason has expert knowledge of medicinal plants, does he not?" he said, without taking his eyes off the queen. "He does indeed, your highness," Rose replied. "Please send for him immediately," he said with anxious fervor. "I believe the queen has been poisoned." And that concludes Chapter 11. I hate to leave you hanging like that, but the good news is you can come back next Thursday for Chapter 12. If you want to find out more about Brenda's books, you can visit brendasbooks.net. Until next time, take care.